I'm going to get us started. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to today's convening on the Cook County Scavenger Sale. I'm Michael Davidson. I'm a senior director at the Chicago Community Trust, where I lead a team that's focused on catalyzing neighborhood investment. This is one of the strategies the trust is using to help close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. The others are growing household wealth, which looks at wealth building at the individual and household level, and building collective power, which is resident focused. We also have a new policy function at the Chicago Community Trust, led by my colleague Ianna Kachoris, who's participating in today's program. The Catalyzing neighborhood investment strategy is fundamentally about getting capital into Black and Latinx communities in a way that builds community scale wealth. The strategy has a very strong focus on the built environment as an economic development driver. We work across three pillars: building the capacity of communities to attract, absorb, and own local investment, supporting community-driven planning and placemaking initiatives, and advancing community finance, real estate development, and policy solutions to change the systems that prevent investment from happening. In early 2020, we made a grant to the Center for Municipal Finance at the University of Chicago to get a better understanding of the Cook County Scavenger Sale. Of all the issues we grapple with in our neighborhood investment work, infill development in communities without access to capital is the biggest and most intractable. But we also see real estate opportunities in these parcels, particularly for the people who live in the neighborhoods that struggle with them. The scavenger sale is one of the tools that can help us, but we've always sort of understood it to be overwhelming at best. For years, community development interests have wondered if it's even working. And if it is, how does it work? And who's participating and who's benefiting? So I am delighted to have four people with us today to understand and help us answer some of these questions. Christopher Berry and Max Schmidt are with the Center for Municipal Finance at the University of Chicago. Chris is a professor at the Harris School of Public Policy and is the academic director of the center, and Max is the principal researcher and author of the Scavenger Sale study. Also with us is Cook County Commissioner Bridget Gaynor. With an MBA from the University of Chicago and a very strong background in finance, Commissioner Gaynor has many notable achievements at the county, including creating the Cook County Land Bank Authority. The commissioner is a strong advocate for reforming the scavenger sale and will help all of us understand how we can apply the research Chris and Max present. And finally, to ground the research in lived experience, I'm pleased to have my friend and colleague, Gian Foreman, with us. Many of us know Gian as president and CEO of Emerald South Economic Development Collaborative, which is bringing new energy and investment opportunities to mid-South Side neighborhoods like Woodlawn, Washington Park, and South Shore. But Gian also has a lot of experience in real estate development. So he's coming into today's conversation as the leader of a community-based organization that deals with troubled parcels, and as a seasoned real estate developer who understands what it takes to get something built. So we've divided today's 90-minute program into three sections, after which we'll do a Q&A with the audience. For the first 20 minutes, Max and Chris will present the scavenger sale findings. After that, I'll engage all four of our guests in conversation about the findings, and then more broadly about real estate development opportunities in the places most impacted by the properties caught up in the scavenger sale. I'll then give the floor to Ianna Kachoris to lead a policy conversation with our guests now that the report is out. And then we'll do a Q&A with all of you. So feel free to use the chat function to get your questions in any time during today's session. And then Ianna's going to close us out with a call to action as we pursue scavenger sale reform. So our hope for today's session is twofold. One, a better understanding of the Cook County Scavenger Sale, including what's not working about it. And two, a deeper resolve into returning troubled parcels back to productive use in a manner that builds wealth in and for Black and Latinx communities. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues Kim Bolton and Liz Weber from the Trust Communications team for making today's session possible. Of course, we could not do this without you. And without further ado, let's hand it over to Chris and Max to present the research.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm Chris Berry, director of the center, and I'm really pleased that we were able to do this research in conjunction with the trust As some of you may know, we've been researching property taxes and property tax issues in Cook County for some time now, beginning with some work on property tax equity that led to some hopefully reforms taking place under Fritz Kaegi. And we've been very interested not just in whether the taxes are fair, but what are the consequences of unfair taxes? So this sort of question has been on our mind for a long time, and being able to take this deep dive into the scavenger sale has been really important for us. I'm going to just give a couple of high-level bullet points and then turn it over to my colleague Max Schmidt, who, as Mike said, was the principal researcher. Our answer to Mike's question about is the scavenger sale working is a resounding no. Our findings is that the system is not working, that our main piece of evidence that leads us to this conclusion is that the vast majority of properties that enter the scavenger sale system never make it back out. Those that do get out often end up being returned to the system not too long later, such that only about 70% of the properties that have been in the system since we've studied it have ever gotten out. So 93% are staying in and going through a cycle of being auctioned and failing to receive a bid over and over again. Those that do get it out are often bid on by large institutions, outside financial interests, who are the biggest participants in the sale. And finally, the properties are dramatically concentrated in a few communities in Cook County. And just when I say dramatically concentrated, Max will show you the evidence of it, but I mean really quite concentrated. And so we see a system that's failing to turn around the properties, that's holding on to them, and that's concentrating them increasingly in a small number of communities. I'll turn it over now to Max, who will provide the details and results of the study.
All right, thank you, Chris. And I'll reiterate, thanks. I'm glad to see so many people interested in this topic. So that's exciting. If we could go ahead and head to the first, there we go. So just as a general overview, two really big things to keep in mind about the scavenger sale. The first, since the recession in 2008, 2009, as might be expected, we saw this huge increase in the number of properties being listed in the sale. So that's to be expected as we saw a large number of foreclosures, housing abandonments, things like that. But as a result, it took the scavenger sale from about 4,000 or 5,000 properties a year to in excess of 30,000 properties at each sale. So it's become a huge program. The other big thing, though, as Chris mentioned, is that the number of those properties that are actually being sold out to private buyers, whether that be developers or home buyers, you name it, is both relatively small, about 6 or 7% each year, and it's been relatively steady. So as you see in this graph here, that little blue section at the bottom, those are sold properties, and you'll note that they haven't fluctuated much year over year. And that includes after the Cook County Land Bank came in. So in 2015, that was the first time Cook County Land Bank participated, and they do take a large number of properties. So that's why we see this no cash bid section growing so significantly. No cash bid, that's any government that may take a property at the scavenger sale. They're not required to pay anything up front. And the overwhelming majority, nearly all of them at this point are accounted for by the Cook County Land Bank. But even following their introduction and their participation, what we've seen is that it hasn't really affected the number of private sales. So either we're not seeing a real impact, or if there is some sort of impact, meaning something the land bank is doing is reducing the number of private buyers. Those private buyers who are being pushed out appear to be replaced by new private buyers. Bottom line being that number hasn't really changed. It's still right around 6% year over year, even with the land bank's participation. If we can go next slide. So the scavenger sale system is a pretty obscure system and very complicated. And so just to give an idea of all that is involved, even before we get to the scavenger sale system, what we have in front of you is basically a very abridged version of the entire assessment, collection, and taxation and delinquency process, all the way from the time it's assessed over on the far left to the time it finally leaves the scavenger sale, which can take up to 20 years. And what's important here is not only is this entire system extremely complicated and quite drawn out, bearing in mind that the time between when a property first goes delinquent to the time it gets on the scavenger sale is at least 3 years. And then once it's on the scavenger sale, it can stay there for up to 20 years. But not only is it really complicated, but what's interesting is that this entire purple section, the entirety of the scavenger sale, actually only accounts for about 0.5% of taxes each year. So by the time we get to the scavenger sale, the county treasurer has already collected 99.5% of taxes. And so what we're dealing with is really a relatively small financial portion, but we're still talking about 30-some thousand properties every given year. We can head to the next one. All right. So as Chris said, the main finding here is that the system is not working. It has a very specific purpose, which the legislature laid out and which the courts have repeatedly reiterated. And that purpose is not to recoup money. The purpose is to return tax delinquent and distressed properties back to the market. The goal here is not to recoup the lost taxes. The goal is simply to get that property back to normal, productive market condition. And to do that, the scavenger sale has basically operated the exact same way since it was created almost 80 years ago. It's had very little reform, none of which have really altered the substance of the scavenger sale, just sort of tweaked minor technical procedures here and there. It's also worth noting that this system of using a scavenger sale is unique not only to Illinois, but it's unique specifically to Cook County. It's the only place in the country we were able to find a program of this nature being operated. But all of that said, as I've been saying, only about 6 to 7% of these properties actually end up going to private buyers. About 1/3 of all of them, of the remaining properties, go to the Cook County Land Bank. And then the remaining 60-some% of properties in any given year don't attract any interest whatsoever, either from the land bank or from private buyers. And so what you see on the right here is basically a graphic representation of this. Really, the important part here is, again, that blue section at the very bottom there. Those are the that's the entirety of all properties that are being sold year over year. Everything else you see here is some other category. Either no one's bidding on it or it's a no cash bid. And what you see here is what's happening is when properties end up in the scavenger sale, it's basically acting as a catch-all. So they've already been through a tax delinquency sale. They've already been distressed for quite some time. And one way or the other, they're ending up in this catch basin that is the scavenger sale, where they basically just cycle through. So if they're lucky, they may get bought a bid, but many of those are coming back into the scavenger sale in later years. And most of them simply aren't attracting any attention at all. And this is important to keep because what has to be remembered here is, unlike the tax sale, where in order to purchase a property, the buyer has to purchase purchase the debt. So the price can be quite high. The scavenger sale is different. The buyer can bid for as low as $250. Bidding starts at $250 and goes up from there. And all you're paying is that upfront bid. You don't pay for your taxes. So effectively, the scavenger sale can reduce a property's acquisition cost to near zero. And even at that point, we are still seeing very few purchases. And so what that suggests is that normal market conditions alone are simply insufficient to meet the scale and the demand of this program and of this problem. We can go to the next one. So this just presents it a little bit differently. This shows you how all of these properties have ended up. The big blue section here, nearly 60% of these have either been forfeited or recycled, meaning they either were bought and returned to the program for one reason or another, or they simply got no attention whatsoever. It's only this 17% here, this gray section. These are all of the properties over the entirety of the period we looked at. So going all the way back to 2007. This is the entirety of properties that ended up going to private developers or private home buyers. And then again, about 1/3, in this case, about, it looks like 12-15% or so are no cash bid type purchases. Bottom line, again, being that the overwhelming majority here are simply not being sold. It's a very small portion. We can go to the next one. So beyond looking at the system in generalities, we also took a look at all of the properties that are in this system. And what we found was that somewhat expectedly, these properties are extremely low valued. So the vast majority of them are isolated, vacant, single family lots throughout the south and west sides of Cook County. Meaning not only are they vacant, but they're not even adjacent to other vacant properties, which makes it tough to sort of bundle them or do anything like that. Just looking at their assessed value, meaning what the county assessor has deemed them to be worth, we're still only looking at about $26,000 for a property. And just given how difficult it is to value properties that are A, vacant, and B, this low valued, it's fair to say that even this $26,000 number is probably a little high. Compare that to the tax debt on most of these is about $18,000, average tax bill of about $500 to $1,000. So tax-wise, they're not terribly atypical, although obviously because they're vacant and low valued, much lower. But for most of these properties, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Like I said, most of them are vacant, and that is the reason for their low value. But there are a number of properties that are built that are still valued fairly lowly. And then there's sort of this other category of properties that may or may not even be appropriate for the scavenger sale at all. So for one, there are unusable properties. These are properties that are small. We're talking 75 square feet on a triangle shaped lot. There's simply no real individual standalone development that can be done on them. They basically need to be adjoined to some other property. And so they may be appropriate for the scavenger sale in that they are genuinely, tax delinquent, but no one's ever going to buy them just because they're not developable. And then there's this other group of properties which are not only not really developable, but they're not even appropriate for this setting. So these are properties that are either should not be taxed at all. Things like tree lawns. We found a couple roads in the property or in the system. So there isn't really a private owner who could come in and buy these or pay off the taxes. They really shouldn't be in here at all. And then there's also quite a few of them, where again, they're small and really it's clear that they're meant to be adjoined to the neighboring property, but somehow over the years, they've kind of gotten separated for taxing purposes. And as we said, they end up in this catch basin. And so, again, because of all of this, most of these properties are not selling even at nearly zero acquisition cost. And as Chris mentioned, we're talking really concentrated distribution here. So more than 90% of these properties were in just a dozen zip codes throughout the south and west side, most of them in the southern suburbs. And in fact, Thornton Township accounts for nearly a quarter of all properties. One thing that's interesting here, and I'll speak to this a little more in a moment, but we had, as part of this, we had developers go out and actually look at these properties and sort of explain why they would be hesitant to buy them. And one of the things that's interesting to note is most of them did not cite things like high taxes or high crime. Most of them pointed to a lack of public investment in the surrounding neighborhood. So what they were concerned with was not necessarily the property itself, but the fact that there were not schools, parks, transit access, employment opportunities, all of those bigger picture issues simply weren't present in that community. So it made the entire community difficult to develop. We can go to the next one. So this is just showing that concentration again. You'll see the overwhelming majority of them are all in these far south suburbs. There is a small pocket on the west side. And then on the north side, there's almost none. There are quite a few zip codes that don't have a single property, even since 2007. So just again, highlighting how concentrated this is. If we go to the next one. All right. So moving beyond the properties, we also took a look at sort of who is buying these properties. If it's not, what we found is that it's not really your small, what you might call mom and pop developers. The way we measured this was by looking at developers that were taking 10 or more properties in a year. We considered those to be institutional actors. It's not really typical that you would see a local home buyer purchase more than 1 or 2 properties at a time. And what we found is that 80% of these properties are being purchased by these larger institutional players. So this isn't the land bank, though they do account for about a third, and they're certainly an institutional actor. But then this also includes what we found typically are large hedge funds. So we looked at some of these large institutional buyers, and there are development organizations in there, but there's also a lot of financial institutions that appear to be involved for, financial purposes, not strictly for redeveloping these properties. And then only about on the other side, only about 4% of these are actually going to the small local developers who are acquiring 1 or 2 properties at a time. And so that really points to 2 problems here. One, as I've mentioned, is this issue of incentive. The type of properties we are looking at here and the nature of the communities they're in just make them extremely difficult to market no matter how you're doing it. And so a system that relies on private bidding, absent any sort of support or incentive, is just not going to meet the demand here. There is also the second issue of access. As I said, the scavenger sale system is unique to Cook County alone, and the way it is run is rather opaque. Basically, every 2 years, the treasurer will put out a list of pins. It is then on potential buyers to investigate each individual pin, find it, look at photos of it, see where it is, see what condition it's in. None of that information is provided up front. And then if and when they're able to decide that they do want to buy it or they are interested in it, the only way to participate is to go to the actual call out auction that takes place in the basement of the county building once every 2 years. And what we actually found was that the majority of these bids are only being placed by about 4 or 5 professional bidders who work for multiple organizations, who really have, understand the intricacies of the system. By comparison, what we see in other communities is, they sort of operate this the way a real estate broker would operate. They've got a website with photos, detailed information. It's really easy to find the properties you're looking at and to place a bid. And we simply don't see that here. If we could go to the next slide. So all of that said, though, I don't want to give the impression that there isn't real opportunity here. When we had these developers go out and look at a random sample of the properties, about 10 to 15% of the properties they looked at, they considered economically viable, meaning they either would be interested in purchasing them themselves or would recommend them to one of their clients. And this actually includes some pretty valuable properties, including more than 250 properties with $1 million plus valuations. So it's not exclusively these isolated vacant lots, though that is the majority. And going back to these economically viable properties, it's not just that they can be rehabbed and turned around, but a substantial portion of them needed little to no improvement. So these are properties that maybe need a new coat of paint, but it would not take a lot to get them back into market condition. And as I was saying earlier, instead, what we heard back from these developers was not so much an issue with the property itself, but with surrounding community area investment. And on the flip side of that, we also heard quite a substantial amount of feedback saying something along the lines of, I understand that this is a neighborhood that is not a traditional target for real estate investment, but I'm committed to this neighborhood, I'm committed to this community, and I would like to be able to purchase houses there, do redevelopment work, but the pieces are not there to make it feasible. So all of that said, bottom line here, once we remove out the inaccurately recorded properties, the properties that are not appropriate for the scavenger sale, applying what we found in our randomized study to the full sample, we're probably looking at about 3,000 to 5,000 properties. So a substantial number of properties that are economically viable could be redeveloped with relatively little investment. But for one reason or another, the private developers simply are not making it to that process or to that outcome. If we could go to the next one. So all this leaves us with a question, where do we go from here? And I'll preface by saying that the point of our study was not to put out specific policy proposals. That's definitely a next step. But there are definitely some sort of directions where it's clear we should push. The first one being that there needs to be some sort of broad, higher level coordinated review of these properties. So there's about 30,000 properties in the scavenger sale. There's another 10,000 or so vacant lots owned by the city of Chicago, and then probably another substantial chunk owned by the other 140 taxing authorities throughout Cook County. Bottom line being is that there are a lot of these distressed properties spread across dozens of different programs, different government entities, and there isn't really a coordinated effort to figure out what is in this pool of properties and how can we better address this at a higher level. It's really just a bunch of individual government entities sort of going about the same objective through separate efforts. So that's sort of the first big takeaway, is that we need to have that coordinated conversation. And then the second is that there are probably some small things that can be fixed relatively easily without, substantial state legislative reform. Things like, moving this to a more accessible format than simply a list of pins, maybe doing it online, things that would simply make it easier to participate. But at the end of the day, our findings suggest that even if we made this system the easiest to work with possible, the real problem is in the nature of trying to get people to purchase these types of properties. And so no matter how well effective we make the scavenger sale, if we really want to address this large backlog of vacant or distressed properties, it's going to take a larger, more holistic legislative fix, something that reinvests in these communities and really tries to tackle all 30, 40,000, however many there might be, with a broader approach. And so those are really the two things that we, moving forward would encourage, all of the various stakeholders who are going to, take this up and move forward with it. Those are really the areas we would encourage them to do so. And I believe that is the last slide in this section. And with that, I will hand it back over to Michael.
Thank you, Max. Really appreciate that. Terrific information. I'm going to go into a few questions. First, for questions directed at you and Chris, and then I'm going to ask Ianna and the commissioner some questions. And if we have time, I'll direct a question to all of you. So I'm going to try to move through these quickly so we can get to a policy discussion with my colleague Ianna. Chris and Max, I'm curious because there's a lot of information in this report, and I'm just wondering if any of the research findings took you by surprise. What took you most by surprise? And an accompanying question, what do you anticipate will be kind of the hardest pill for us to swallow with these findings, and why? So findings that took you by surprise, and what do you anticipate is going to be the most difficult thing for us to sort of move through or follow through with these findings, and why?
I'll take a first crack and then hear from Max. I'm curious if we have similar answers. I mean, the thing that took me most by surprise is the heavy presence of these outside financial institutions that are buying these properties in large numbers. I did not see that coming. I don't claim even at this point we have a full understanding of what their MO is and why they're doing this. We have learned through the course of this research that the same institutions are active in other cities buying up the same kinds of properties. So I think that was most surprising to me. A lot of the other things here, I think we had some inkling of before we got into it. How about you, Max?
Yeah, that was my biggest surprise. Not only the scale of their involvement, but the nature, because not only are they acquiring large numbers, but the overwhelming portion of the properties they acquire, more than 90% of them are actually then being returned at a later date, meaning they acquire them admittedly for very low risk. Sometimes when they return it, they can actually have the sale voided and get all of their money back. But even when they can't do that, it's only, a few $100s they're losing. But nevertheless, we're seeing these companies taking hundreds and hundreds of properties, and then they don't appear to be doing anything with them. And that's where Chris says, we still can't quite tell, if there's some sort of outside financial tool or that they might be exploiting or what. But, at the end of the day, what we can say is that these aren't being acquired for development purposes, or at least they're not being developed thereafter.
And just to follow up with this, what do you think will be the most difficult, just in your opinion as researchers, or not in your opinion, what the research is suggesting? What do you think might be the most difficult thing that we have to do as a region to deal with this?
To me, the most difficult thing here is that there's not one flaw in the system, a single flaw that is causing this result that we could simply go fix. You know, you get a sense from that really complicated slide that Max showed about just how intricate the whole process is, and each piece is interconnected. And when we really looked into this, we didn't come away saying, oh, you know, the scavenger sale itself is flawed. It's not being administered well. You know, it's not being advertised, or there's ways in which it could be improved for sure, but we don't see a single particular flaw in administration or design that is leading to this result. And what that means is that fixing it is going to be much more complicated than, you know, the simple kind of improvements which we do recommend, like advertising these properties better, making the system more accessible to people. But it runs much deeper to the nature of the properties themselves.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Max.
I would just expand on that a little bit to say that, you know, I think the thing that's going to be hard to swallow is the sheer scale of the issue we're working with here. You know, there's all sorts of great programs, dollar lots, what have you, to do individual properties or a small number of properties. But the reality is that we're talking, you know, tens of thousands of properties at this point, which is simply beyond the capacity of, you know, even if the entire private development market were to come together and decide they were only going to do these, 40,000 properties is a lot to develop all at once. And so I think not only does this require a higher level sort of policy approach, but I think we need to come to terms with the fact that it's going to be a big, difficult lift.
Right. We're not gonna program our way out of this.
Right.
Yeah. This needs some kind of well, there's a massive subsidy and some kind of market opportunity that we need to create here. I'm going to go to the next question. Chris and Max, the qualitative component of the research, which I thought was terrific, and it involved real estate developers assessing these properties in person to gauge their kind of viability in the marketplace. How does the qualitative research add value to the quantitative analysis here? How are these findings kind of better for having qualitatively engaged developers?
Well, I think what made those findings so important is that when we look only at the data, the hard data from the scavenger sale, what we're seeing really is the documentation of the behavior of the people who had access, right? The people who, you know, the transactions that take place are those bids and purchases made by people with access to the system. There's lots of other people without access to the system, or maybe don't even know about the system. And so what we really wanted to know is, you know, are these properties just not being bought because the small number of people who participate in the system are uninterested, or is there something deeper about it? And that's what the qualitative research gave us. And, you know, the findings were super important, as Max highlighted, because what these developers showed us is there are in fact lots of properties in the system, and not the majority, to be clear, but plenty in the thousands that have value and that look pretty good as they are. And, you know, I should add, many of the developers who participated with us weren't aware of the scavenger sale, had never participated in it. So I think without their participation, we would be left with simply the impression that virtually none of these properties sell, therefore they must be worthless. And that's not what we heard from the developers.
Right. The vast majority of these properties are in majority Black communities. I'm wondering if the research points to why this is the case, or what we can conclude from this. I wonder if you as the researchers have a response to that.
I do, but Max, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it does begin to answer why that question may be. You know, there's sort of this anecdote that when you look at Cook County, no matter what policy issue you're looking at, there's really one map, and it always kind of looks the same. And I think this really highlights that that the reason, and this was one of the big things we got from asking developers, that the reason these folks are not maybe more interested in these properties is not because of, you know, one or two specific reasons. It's not just because there's high taxes or just because there's high crime. Those might be part of it. But the larger issue that everyone sort of agreed on, and all of the developers we talked to pointed to, was this broader lack of public investment. And so, you know, in a county like Cook County, where so frequently, every policy issue we looked at, we see lower investment in specific parts of the county, which happen to correlate, not entirely by chance, with primarily Black neighborhoods. And there is some spillover into other neighborhoods of color. But at the end of the day, one thing we can say for all of these areas of different policy concern is that the areas that have been most underinvested have been areas of color, and there is huge overlap. And so it's not just one thing or another. I think part of the reason here that we're seeing so much, it's so specific to Black communities, not just communities of color or communities of lower income in general, is the highly concentrated nature of this particular program, which itself is probably related to the sort of cyclical nature here. So, properties get in, then they deteriorate because they never come out here. And so they just get worse and worse and worse, become a bigger and bigger financial strain on the surrounding community. And the more of those that come up, the harder it is, or the lower taxes there are for these communities. And so they raise their tax rates. And so you end up with this just cyclical, properties come in, that lowers taxes, tax rate has to go up, fewer properties are bought, more properties come in. And so it just keeps concentrating further and further and further into a smaller and smaller subset.
Yeah, I would only just add just a couple points to that, which is that, again, this isn't something we can see in isolation, and it's related to other kinds of inequities that are familiar. And so, as I noted at the beginning, we got interested first in taxes in Cook County by studying property tax inequities. And it's no accident, I think, that many of the same communities that are suffering from tax delinquencies are those that were taxed unfairly to begin with. So we have a system in which people are taxed too much. Many people can't pay the taxes. And then as far as on the redevelopment side, I think we all know that lack of access to capital in communities of color is a persistent problem. And so one of the things we heard from our developers who participated in this survey is there's lots of valuable properties here, but they don't have the capacity to develop them at large scale. So developers would say, wow, there's dozens of properties in this neighborhood that look great, but for me, I may be doing one this year. So that that's just not going to get to the kind of scale of capital that's needed for the development that would match the scale of the problem.
So thank you for that, and that's a great segue. So Gian, I'm going to ask you a few questions here. You're a person who understands troubled parcels from the point of view of a community leader and real estate developer. And I want you to put your Emerald South Economic Development Collaborative CEO cap on here for a moment. How do you think community-based organizations, how can they develop the skills and the capacity to deal with real estate development? And more specifically, how can we prepare them to use something like the scavenger sale to secure properties? What are your thoughts from the community-based organization point of view?
I think it's strategic partnerships is the answer. The scale is too massive to try to take it on your own. The financing tools and resources as they exist today kind of don't exist. In the communities in which I work, you can see what the land bank is doing, and it's having significant impact. And you can look in certain quadrants of a neighborhood and see just when you put the peanut butter on really thick, the kind of impact that it has. So I think there should be some new tools. As I'm sitting and listening to Max and Christopher, if I make the assumption 4,000 units and they're valued at $25,000 each, that's $100 million in value. Why is there not a tool where you can use leverage like everyone else does, to use leverage to say that Thornton Township, I think you said, let's put $25 million worth of development and then that'll go back into the fund. I think they're very simple solutions that we can think of. And that starts to answer the other questions about improving the schools, improving the parks, right? When you can start to see investment and the tools that exist. There are models that people are talking about now about cooperative ownership. So who owns city-owned land? Who owns county-owned land? I think it's the people who pay the taxes. Personally, I don't think Bridget owns the land. I think I pay taxes to Cook County. I think I own the land. Right? So create some incentives, create some tools where we can leverage those things. Otherwise, it baffles me as a real estate developer how a lot can go for sale for $1 and it doesn't get sold because people don't see it as an asset. On a balance sheet, it's an asset any way you look at it, right? And our communities have been so devalued that even if the lot is next door to you, you don't see it as value. And so I think there needs to be some additional tools created.
Gian, would you respond differently with your for-profit developer cap, or would your for-profit developer cap have the same response?
Exact same response.
Okay. Yeah.
The neighborhoods in which I invest as a for-profit developer is the same neighborhoods I invest as a nonprofit developer. There's no difference in the margin that I get on the back end. It might take us 15 years to develop a vacant lot, right? Before the land is, before there's a buyer for it, right? I mean, now we're talking about Woodlawn. 10 years ago, nobody was talking about Woodlawn. 10 years ago, I mean, unless it was a special event like the Olympics or something like that. But we live in these communities every day. So yeah, exact same.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm going to pivot to the commissioner for the last few minutes. And, you know, Commissioner Gaynor, it looks like the Cook County Land Bank is the only mission-driven institutional purchaser in the scavenger sale. And we're really grateful for that. And, you know, Gian just said, you know, when the Cook County Land Bank is involved, he's seeing tangible difference in the communities that he works in. So we're really grateful about it. But the problem clearly is overwhelming. So I'm just wondering, what can the land bank do to put more scavenger sale properties into the marketplace? What do you think? Especially we've got new leadership at the land bank. So this is a great time to start talking about.
Eleanor Gorski joins us in a couple of weeks. So I think that one of the interesting things is to go back to what Max had laid out. So while the chart looks overwhelming, there's two big impediments that slow the interest or dampen the interest of people who have a real community development vibe. And that is one that you saw those charts, that doesn't even show all the steps required. There are about 75 distinct steps to take something when you bid on it at the scavenger sale to when it can go to deed and get out to the market. That is just, that's a barrier to entry that exists because someone says, you know what, forget it. It takes too long. My money's going to be tied up for too long. But the good news about that actually is that those are man-made rules. Those aren't things that exist in some like macro economy somewhere. We created those rules. The land bank went to Springfield. We changed two of the rules. We lowered the interest rate on some of the taxes and gave municipalities a few tools, but there is a lot more to be done. The difficult part is, you know, the 2.5-year waiting time that it says you have to wait 2.5 years before even if a house has been vacant for a decade to get it out to the market. That's in the Illinois Constitution. You know, longer story there for anyone who's interested, but you know, that's an impediment. Having said that, vacant land, commercial property, industrial property, that stuff can be cleared in 6 months. So, you know, when Max pointed out that the private buyers are in there and many of them purchase property and return it, it's because we have set up the system, again, with man-made rules that allow them to go in, get 2 years for free to basically market a property. If someone's interested, they buy it. If not, these guys return it, they get their money back. And this is the whole thing about the land bank, or the scavenger sale has been designed to benefit a very limited number of people. They like it just the way it is, but it doesn't work for anyone else. So, you know, the thing to me that is the biggest impetus for reform is that, you know, when you looked at that small number, there's about 100 properties that leave by private buyers and go to deed. The land bank's taking out 1,000 this year. And these aren't gentrifying neighborhoods. These are work-a-day blocks all over the city, all in these neighborhoods that people see as distressed. And there is a market when you lower kind of the false barrier to entry and all those, you know, additional costs and time and uncertainty. When you get rid of that and a developer can just walk in of their own volition, there's a tremendous demand. You know, we've had developers go to that basement room of the scavenger sale and they say it's like bringing monopoly money to Wall Street. They don't have a chance to participate. So the good news is this is doable. It's not easy, but a lot of it is in our control and we need to take that action.
Thank you for that. And I'm gonna ask you one more question, Commissioner, before I hand the floor over to Ianna to have a policy conversation with the four of you. And I want to go back to my question about most of these properties being in majority Black communities. I'd like to get your thoughts about the scavenger sale as one tool in the economic development toolbox. What other economic development tools do we need to create, or maybe which tools do we need to sharpen for the scavenger sale to work optimally?
Well, look, I don't think the scavenger sale is salvageable, because I think the scavenger sale rules are written for only parts of the county where land is of high value and properties turn over. So for communities that have, lower value property or other kind of infrastructure issues going on, I think what we need to do is dramatically reduce the red tape and requirements to get access to that property. I'd like to go in and wholesale clear title and clear tax. And the land bank we went in hot to the scavenger sale in 2015. It was hard. We ended up returning a lot of stuff. It was confusing, but I'd like to go in and aggressively clear title, clear tax, and put that all on the market. To Guion's point, who owns this property? This is a public asset. And we get kind of tricked into thinking that it's, vacant land is a liability. It's not a liability. In nice neighborhoods, they call it open space. And in neighborhoods that have problems, they call it vacant land. And so same thing. And so we need to aggressively go in, clear tax, clear title, and it needs to be everybody's job, not just the land bank.
Thank you for that. This has been a great discussion. I had 3 or 4 more questions, but we just don't have time for those. We need to have the policy conversation with Ianna. And Ianna, so I'm going to introduce you and hand you the floor, so then we can get to a Q&A with the audience. So Ianna Kachoris, our senior director, who leads our policy shop here at the Chicago Community Trust.
Great, thank you, Michael. And thanks all for the great conversation and presentation of the findings, because I think what was evident in this conversation is that there's a much deeper and robust conversation to have around the tools and the systems that we have designed and created, and how do we need to reimagine those. And that's really what we hope for this conversation to be about today. So I'm just going to pick up where I think the conversation really left off, which is how do we think much more holistically about the scavenger sale system and how it's part of this broader system. And I want to go back to the point that Max made to start out, that Cook County is really one of the only counties in the country, or is the only county in the country that has a scavenger sale. And just ask the question, do we need a scavenger sale system? Would we create a system like this if we were starting from scratch? I guess I'll open it up. Maybe Commissioner Gaynor, I'll start with you, and then have everybody chime in.
I think you made a really great point about the uniqueness of the way we structure it. We let private buyers come in first, and the public interest has to compete with a hedge fund or a bank to determine who should get access to the property. And that doesn't really make any sense, because there should be a thriving private market. But what we've just, what's really been illuminated by the study done by Max and Chris has been that there is a market when we remove a lot of the requirements that have been kind of instituted. I'm not saying that they were instituted to make competition harder and to give certain people access, but that's been the impact of it. So, every other major urban county allows kind of a right of first refusal by nonprofit or government interests on the development side, and then we go back to the private buyers. There's this myth that the private tax buyers kind of infuse all this money into this sale. Just to give you a little sense, these guys pay the taxes. They get 18 to 35% interest on a fully collateralized loan with a 95% repayment rate. So there's no charity going on here. You could do a tax anticipation note for a much better deal for the government. So we definitely need a new way of thinking about it, because the way it works now benefits few and hurts a lot of people.
Thanks, Gian, or Max or Chris, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just say, in comparison to how it's done elsewhere, and do we need this sort of system? We certainly need some system for dispensing with, tax delinquent properties. There's always going to be properties that fall into that situation. So we have to have a system. I think what's really, I see as different here compared to other places is we have sort of a market-based approach where we put them up for auction. And we don't have an approach for those that don't sell at the auction. So a lot of other places have, the property goes up for auction. If it hasn't sold, then it goes into, some sort of a plan B, some sort of public ownership, some sort of land bank, some sort of other use. Our system is so weird because we have a first auction. If it doesn't sell, that's the tax auction. If it doesn't sell there, we put it into a second auction. If it doesn't sell there, we wait 2 years and we auction it again. And so I think what we really need is to I think the private market is important. I think the auctions are important. I think, of course, if there's a private buyer who's going to put it back into the marketplace, we want that to happen. And if anything, our study says it could happen a little bit more than it is. But at the end of the day, there's a very large number of these that no matter how many times we put them up for auction is not going to be a different outcome. And so how we need to change the system is to do like other places do, is acknowledge at some point, okay, this auctioning isn't working. What's the plan B? And that's where I see us needing a completely new approach here in Cook County.
The only one thing I would add to sort of piggyback off of what everyone is saying here is that, having a more targeted alternative approach can also address some of these other issues. So as Ianna was talking about, these isolated lots are just difficult to make financially viable. But one of the things we saw, for instance, in New York City, where they also have a large, problem with vacant lots, is that they've just sort of accepted the reality of that the private market is not going to be sufficient to buy these properties. And so they have a whole system set up to move those out of the normal tax delinquency system and address them more holistically. And one of the things they're able to do is to bundle these isolated vacant lots together, bundle them with lots that aren't vacant. And as a result, they're able to make them more financially viable, make them lower risk, and really encourage development. But doing so required really moving away from this just complete reliance on the normal tax sale.
So I'm gonna take a quote from you, Max. You said one of the things about the scavenger sale, it's intended to return it to normal condition. Normal condition is not a good condition. So I don't think that this is a good outcome. So I think it should be something completely different. I don't think it's a good thing to match this terrible property with a good property, because the person is only going to concentrate on the good property and not the bad property. I think we should utilize leverage, just like what the institutional investors are doing. Cook County, City of Chicago, State of Illinois, they have bonding capacity, lower interest rates than the people in these communities. Put the money out there. Let's think about shared ownership models. Let's think about how do you develop developers in these communities? Because you go into Thornton Township, Thornton Township, the people in Thornton, they love Thornton. Right? They're not trying to escape Thornton. They love Thornton. So put something together so they can continue to love it even more, right? Put the money in place, put the tools in place that exist. It's the same tools that the private market is using. We just don't efficiently use it with government.
I love this conversation because it really truly is opening up at the aperture of saying, okay, we have this scavenger sale, but there's all these different elements and pieces of the puzzle that we need to be thinking about. That said, we did want this conversation to be very focused on what do we need to do from a practical standpoint, and reforming the system wholesale is probably not always the easiest way to start. But I'm wondering if we could reflect a little bit. We had the slide up there that Max created of the different points in the tax sale process, and the point at which it gets to the scavenger sale. It's already gone through many touch points throughout the system, government agencies, systems, and processes, and that presents an opportunity for different levels. So where should we, if we're focused on the scavenger sale system, where should we start a conversation about reforming the scavenger sale system, and what are the policy levers that we need to be thinking about?
You can start at go ahead, Commissioner.
No, I was just gonna say, first of all, I think we're raising the profile, which is why this conversation is so good, because we have to get more people to understand what it is to demand change. A lot of it is codified in Springfield, so we got to go to Springfield and get legislative change. We had a small victory after, being beaten like dogs, I will admit it, for the first 3 years when there was a very powerful tax buyer lobby. So I admit to that. But we were successful in May, and I think that there is a lot more to do in that regard. So part of it is the legislative process, but the second part is bringing enough people together, suburbs, private developers, others, to say, this is what's in the scavenger sale. This is the property they're talking about. Does any of it capture your interest and excitement? Do you look at some of those vacant lots and say, hey, I know who owns these other ones, or I'm interested in this community, and it makes you think I could assemble something from there that's really worthwhile. So getting, the scavenger sale has been announced for November of this year. We need to go in there with a plan, and it has to be a collective that goes in with the plan to purchase this property. Sorry, Gian.
Nah, so I was gonna say scavenger sale is at the end of the process. If you really want to talk about it, you have to start at the beginning of the process. Trying to fix, I serve on the Chicago Police Board, so trying to only fix the end of the process is not really going to solve anything. You got to start at the beginning of the process. So Kathy said, what about the annual sale, right? And I think that that's some of what the land bank is doing, is looking early on and saying, hey, let's take a look at some of these communities. Let's turn some of these communities around. Let's not wait till it gets to the point of the scavenger sale to be able to improve some of these things. So the advice that I would say on that is let's look at the entire system.
Great. And I think that was actually one of my questions. So again, I'm glad you went there, is how do we think about making sure that properties don't end up in the scavenger sale in the first place? I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that, but also where there might be opportunities for reform in this conversation. And I'm just going to put a note out there. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to audience Q&A. So please put your questions in the chat and we'll pull those in. But if we could start before we turn to audience questions with, what are the opportunities that are ahead of us? Commissioner Gaynor, you mentioned the upcoming November sale. There may be some legislative opportunities. What are those opportunities in front of us?
So the rules around the scavenger sale are embedded in the Illinois property tax code. And so what the first steps are, looking at some of these initial requirements. Now, Ian's exactly right. One of the things we actually did get passed in the spring was allowing municipalities to get a hold of vacant property earlier. So if something was vacant in your town, the only way, even if it was vacant, 3 years, no pay taxes, a municipality could not take it over until it was literally ready to fall down. Could be unsafe, could have had a fire, could be a magnet for crime. So now the rule is you can get access to that if it's a public nuisance or if it's unsafe. That stops the property from going into the scavenger sale. So we're trying to go further upstream. But it's looking at the number of requirements for court appearances, for appraisals, for inspections, for notifications to, if you have a property that's been vacant for more than 36 months, that they're gone. Let's just admit that they're gone and then move on and not have the same, having to send them 15 different notices waiting for people to apply. The land bank doesn't go after property from the scavenger sale that's occupied. So when we bid on property, say you start out with a big number, 7,000, you drop the stuff that's occupied, you send people letters and see if they're interested. The land bank has actually collected $14 million just by sending letters out to people with property in the scavenger sale saying, hey, are you still interested in this property? Because if not, we are. And then they paid their taxes. So even just, that's technically the treasurer's role, but even just sending out a letter saying you're interested has created $14 million in revenue. And then you have, like Chris was saying, the easements and stuff, but you could eliminate half of the administrative tasks associated with going to deed, because that acts as an incredible barrier to entry to a small developer. When you tell them that they've got to hire a lawyer and it's going to take 2 years and the outcome is uncertain, you're not setting up to start out with a group of people that's largely, very well off, money, representing banks and almost exclusively white. That's what you're getting, because you're making it almost impossible for small developers to participate. So lowering the barrier to entry is job one.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on this, lowering the barrier to entry is really important. I don't think there's anything legislatively that's preventing us from making the sale more accessible to people in the way that happens in other jurisdictions. Yes. For instance, having a website with actually has pictures and information about the properties instead of just publishing a spreadsheet with pins in it. So I think there's a lot that could be done. I don't know if it could be done by November, but there's a lot that could be done without major legislative fixes. I agree with the deeper issues go all the way to the Constitution. And of course, Gianna is right that we should really think of, by the time the property reaches the scavenger sale, we've already failed. So, because how do you reach this? You've gone years without paying your taxes. You've gone through 2 cycles of the annual sale without anyone bidding or buying your taxes, and only then. So something's gone wrong by the time you get there, and we should try to prevent future properties from getting there. But the fact of the matter is, we now have something like 30,000 properties there, and we have to deal with them. And I agree, access should be job one. And then just rethinking this market-based approach, as I said before. At the end of the day, no matter how much access we generate, we can certainly improve it, but there's going to be some subset of properties that are just left there, even with no barriers to entry. And we've got to have a plan B that is not a market-based approach for those properties.
Very helpful.
Ianna,
sorry.
Since you're here and Michael is here, I also think that philanthropy needs to play a role as well. I think corporate should play a role, right? Because there's a correlation between, I don't know if it's correlation or it's causation or what it is, but where the crime happens, where the schools are failing, where the air quality is bad, right? So when we have philanthropy, corporate stepping in, I guarantee you it's a McDonald's in those neighborhoods. So how do we get corporate to start to step in and play a part of this bigger solution is also going to be critical.
That's certainly true. And actually that kind of relates to one of the first questions that I think was in the chat. I think Christy De Laurentiis put this in about, there's a question about the 90% in just a dozen zip codes, and asking whether, Chris and Max, you've explored other correlating factors, some of which Gian just mentioned, besides public infrastructure to where these properties are located.
So we didn't do a real deep dive correlation analysis. For one, I think that list is probably endless. I think the way I would frame it is that we see correlation with just about any policy area you want to look at. So these areas where we're seeing high concentration, it's not just correlated with 1 or 2 things. In fact, that's something we heard from many developers, is that it's correlated with a huge number of things. So everything from schools to employment opportunity to parks to crime to taxes. Really take your pick. There's overlap for all of those.
Sorry, Bridget, were you going to, Commissioner Gaynor, were you going to jump in there?
No, I think, yeah.
Okay. So there's a number of questions about the process and who's in charge of the system. How large is their staff? How big is their budget? Sort of who are the actors? And we've touched on some of them. I think someone just put in the chat, the Cook County Treasurer plays a role. But maybe we could do just a quick overview of that.
Sure. So as far as the scavenger sale goes, it's contained almost entirely in-house at the Treasurer. So the three, or really the 2 big players in all of this assessment taxation are the assessor, who has to calculate property values. But then beyond that, it's almost exclusively handled by the Treasurer. They're responsible for managing it. They're responsible for publishing it, all of those. And Commissioner Gaynor, maybe you can speak better to the size and capacity of the Treasurer. That's a little bit beyond what we looked at.
No, look, the Treasurer is incredibly competent. She runs a well-oiled machine. Anyone who's worked with her knows that. They have been running the scavenger sale for 20 years. It's something well known to them. She's added a lot of automation to it over the course of time and done a lot to eliminate some of the self-dealing of bids that used to happen. I do actually think that Chris made a really good point, which is when you get this list of properties, it's hard to really assess what you're looking at. It's not, it'd be great if it could be closer to, not to sound silly, but like to a Zillow listing or to something that you click on it, you see it on a map, you'd be able to look at the condition of the property. One of the reasons that the land bank bid on so many properties in each of these sales is because you had to go through kind of big attributes. We're interested in single family homes, 2 to 4 flats, these zip codes, and we'll take, everything that's there, because then afterwards you can go and look at it, check it out, see if it's if it's salvageable, if it's occupied. So again, it gets back to, unless you've got a big infrastructure, I mean, the land bank's not huge, it's got 12 employees though, and they're experts in building assessment and rehab. And if you don't have that, you're a sole practitioner, developer, you're kind of out of your league because you got to bid on some stuff. You have no idea if it's going to be any good for you.
And just to add on, I mean, this is not a huge burden in today's day and age to develop, a website that has this basic information in a searchable, accessible way with photos, perhaps from, Google Street View or, aerial photos. That's totally doable. Again, it's not going to solve this problem, but when we want to think about access to like more ordinary folks or small scale developers who are not going to pour over, a spreadsheet filled with thousands of, individual PIN numbers, these kind of things should be doable and will make a difference.
Chicago Community Trust funded an organization called Cityscape. They already invented it. You don't even have to go do it. They already have it.
Appreciate that.
Was this a setup to make sure that we said like, oh, the trust already solved the problem? So there you go, we're good.
No, they didn't solve the problem. The tool,
Definitely not.
The tool is already there.
Definitely not. Well, and certainly and I think the way that Max presented it in his presentation, that there are certainly like administrative quick fixes that we can be thinking about, but we also need to be thinking about the sort of the larger systemic, perhaps the fixes in the legislative and in the statute. And that's actually another question from the chat, which is how much of this is really defined in the statute, and where are those opportunities to make those tweaks outside of that, and where do we really need to have a legislative push?
To go back and again, this is also not a setup, but I do remember like in the very beginning days of the land bank, we spent a bunch of nights at the trust for these hackathons where people got together with the technology and mapping. And we used that a lot to figure out what was post the financial crisis. Why were some neighborhoods having vacant property when otherwise there shouldn't be a lot of vacant property there? Marynook and Chatham or Pill Hill or something like that, where it didn't make any sense. That is probably, while maybe not a fully crowdsourced answer, Ianna, it's closer to that than a singular person, because I will say the reception in Springfield was incredibly positive. This ended up getting full bipartisan support across the state. And because there are land banks beyond Cook County, there's Peoria and Decatur and Rockford. So it's really a statewide issue. Ours is just kind of more extreme. But I think a combination of the street level knowledge of developers and people who want to be developers in communities where there's vacant property to say this is desirable to us, and then a legal analysis of the bill language to say, okay, if we were serious about changing this, how could we write it specifically to change the experience so the next time a guy walks in to the scavenger sale, he doesn't think he's bringing monopoly money to Wall Street. He thinks he's got a fighting chance to bid on property.
So another question that I had, and I'm just going to take the privilege of being moderator to kind of jump in here. I'm wondering who needs to be in these conversations around how we fix the broader system. It affects everyone from, community, residents on the blocks to, municipal leaders, to the county commissioners and leadership and legislators. But who really needs to be part of the conversation to make this a meaningful sort of exercise to say what we have is not working and what are the solutions?
I'll give a quick answer, but then I'll open it up. I mean, it's clearly, as close to the ground as you can. So the developers that are working in communities for sure, and the nonprofits that are thinking about affordable housing, because the thing about taking property out of the scavenger sale, it creates an opportunity for naturally occurring affordable housing. The reason that so few properties get bid on by the private buyers is because they're looking for a killing. They're looking for something that makes 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times their money because the process is so difficult. But we can create naturally occurring affordable housing. So, LISC and NHS and CSC and those guys that have big footprints and can do strategic things, even the United Way. I mean, we've been talking a lot, they got a really interesting grant from the lady that's Mackenzie Scott, and they're looking at real estate development. There's an opportunity to Gan's point, there's a philanthropic interest to maybe convey some, create some tools, but you've got to get the people closest to the ground who understand what can be developed in a neighborhood. So opening it up to that is, I think, the first step.
I also think there's some non-traditional things we could think about. I read that Ted Turner, he owns so much land in Montana, right? We have flooding problems. We can talk, Ted Turner, come buy some of this, turn this into some open space, as they would call it on the north side. But we want you to come make this investment, right? An investment in buying the land, maintaining the land, helping us think about some of the flooding problems and some of the other kinds of things that we could think about, right? And so, I mean, I think there's a lot of creative solutions that we could bring to the table.
Yeah, I think looking to the people who are living in these communities is absolutely where this needs to start. Not only because, ask these folks, what are the things your community needs? One that might help address some of these alternative uses Ianna is talking about. Maybe these folks will tell you, I don't need another house right there, but we don't have a park. We don't have a community garden. We don't have a grocery store. But at the same time, you want to go back to this question of correlates, the same concerns that these folks are voicing just in general about schools, parks, transit access, what have you. Those seem to be the same things that are disincentivizing people from moving back into these communities. So I think you can tackle both this issue of alternative uses and highlighting specifically what needs to be done to make these communities as a whole more attractive to development. But you can only do that by asking the folks who are already there, who are already committed to these communities, who are already committed to these neighborhoods.
Really, really terrific ideas. And I'm wondering, so, to this point, and Max, you highlighted some things that New York was doing. Joanna Trotter, our colleague from the Trust, put in the chat, what would be another research component, or could there be another exploration of what other counties are doing for these kinds of end stage properties, not just those, but tax sales overall, and what can we learn? Chris and Max, you've been doing work in other places. What can we learn from these other places that can be carried forward in this conversation?
I mean, I think, so first of all, I think the idea of that being a logical next step is absolutely right. I think a survey of best practices is very much in order. I think already, and Max and I, this wasn't our agenda in this first study, but even just from a cursory look at other places, I think we identified a couple of things that we've already mentioned. One is, other places we look have a much more accessible system, just in terms of the information that's available, how people participate, that sort of thing. And then secondly, the places we looked at have what I refer to as the plan B. After the attempt to return it to the market through an auction or something like an auction, when that doesn't work, they pivot to something else, whether it's a land bank like or other things. And whereas I feel like ours is just like layers of auctions upon auctions, and we're lacking that. So I completely agree that a survey of best practices would be a great next step from a research perspective. Max, I don't know if you have other things to add.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the other thing to keep in mind here is Chicago and Cook County are extremely unique just by virtue of how large we are and how many factors are going into this. And so we didn't really look at all of the alternatives that are out there, but generally speaking, I can tell you they kind of fall into one of two categories. Either you have smaller communities who are able to effectively manage this issue just through their regular tax sale, or you have large metropolitan areas like Chicago, like New York City, where the issue is beyond just one or two properties. It's become a large systemic issue that requires a very unique, very customized approach. And so I think we need to not be misled into thinking that there is an easy alternative here. I think whatever it is going to be taking maybe bits and pieces from other places. And so, yeah, someone really needs to take a look at what those other unique approaches are.
And Rodney Brown raised the question about whether one of those fixes or opportunities might be, can local residents be given first chance at acquisition? Is that something you've seen in other places, or is that something that's feasible in this process?
I'll make a quick point, because I think building on what Chris had said, is the land bank has come in because the system was broken, and it's acting as a clearance mechanism and then a wholesaler to small developers. The small developers have no neighborhoods, people have no ability to access this themselves because it's too complicated. So, it would be my fondest wish that, isn't even needed for that, that you get to the point where you've changed the system such that people come in kind of through their own volition and make their own choices. But right now, we're acting as this intermediary. I think it'll be a minute until we can get it to be easy enough to be accessible to the average small developer.
But even thinking, bigger, it would be, the plan for what happens when things have not sold at auction. Why not have a process by which
Totally.
a community member or a neighbor can simply claim that property? After it fails to, we don't want them to, if there's a real market use for it, that's great. But for those that have failed through the auction process, why not have a process for the neighbor to claim it and maybe not to pay taxes on it, so long as they're not using it, for some redevelopment purpose. Maybe they're using it for a community garden. I just think there's lots of creative approaches we could have.
Yep.
That get outside the auction altogether.
But even if they are using it for commercial purposes, it's not doing any good for the county right now. Give them 5 years, give them 10 years, right? They're probably cutting the grass. They're probably shoveling the snow, raking the leaves, pulling the tires off of it that people have dumped. Pay them for it. You know what I mean? You pay them in the form of, you don't have to pay taxes for the next 7 years. You know what I mean? I think sometimes the solutions are so right in front of us, you can't even call it low-hanging fruit. It just appeared right on your tongue.
To that point, I would note we actually saw that quite a bit in these properties we looked at, where it might be a vacant lot, quote unquote, but it's right next to an occupied lot, and that next door neighbor has already is using it for some sort of commercial business. That's where they're parking all of their landscaping trucks or whatever it might be. They're already taking care of this property. So that is already there and ready to be taken advantage of. And the only other thing I would say, to Commissioner Gaynor's earlier point, this is a human created beast. So whether or not local residents get first dibs, that's a decision we can make. And in fact, we make that with all sorts of housing programs where we give priority to local residents. So it is really low hanging fruit.
I just want to follow up on what Deanne said, which is there's a big difference between giving someone property to deal with and have a title to and ownership and do some value with it, versus saying, I'm going to ignore the fact that you may or may not be making use of this, but I'm going to take it back from you at any point in time that I want to. And I'm going to keep accruing this false sense of what really is bad debt. When you think about a lot of these back taxes, that meter's running, that debt is there. And we kind of let it hold over people like a sword of Damocles. It makes people shy away from development, but it's not enough just to let them use it, because it's kind of like, you can use it until it's valuable to me and then I want it back. You need to push it out there, see what happens. Because to Guillaume's point, you want to say, and like Pat Quinn used to always say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. This stuff's sitting there now for decades. No one's paying taxes. It's, the property is degrading the rest of the neighborhood. We can live with that. But for some reason, if we think we're giving something to people that don't deserve it, it gives us a heart attack,
Well, it's clear that there are no shortage of ideas and ways that we can reimagine this system, and some of it might be in front of us, and some of it may be worth more deeper conversation, which is what we hope to have happen as a next step coming out of this. There are a couple of more questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to answer them before we wrap up. Sheila Sutton from Housing Action Illinois asked is there a plan to work with local lenders in a stronger way to help local people maintain their property outside of the tax structure or inside of the tax structure? And Sheila, if I didn't capture that right, please feel free to jump in.
I'll leave this more to, I think on the lender side, Guillaume's more of the expert than I would be. I think that is a second order issue. We got to give people access to the property first. But Guillaume, I don't know what your thoughts are about access to capital after that. You're on.
That's the reason I think that you have to create this tool to leverage all of this land. I mean, trying to do it on an individual basis, I think you're going to run into the challenges that it's another panel probably taking place right now about access to capital in these neighborhoods. So I think that some kind of fund where you can leverage all of this value, right? Individually may not be worth a lot, but collectively it is. I think that in order to get the kind of capital that you need, that's where you look. And then this is where you start to bring in these other models, community ownership models and that kind of thing. You start to bring that into it. CHA has a thing where you can use your voucher to acquire property, right? So you start to bring in these things. We have these individual conversations and never connect the dots. So this, the sister conversation is taking place on another Zoom as we speak, but we don't connect the two.
Hi, Ianna, this is Sheila. I just wanted to follow up with that question. I appreciate that the properties need to be accessible. I think one of the things that I think about is, or at least my understanding is that there is a concern that if you purchase this property, if you're maintaining it, depending on the scale of your own capacity, what you come with, right? That there is a financial burden associated, whether that's for an individual or for a group of folks. And if there's not some kind of buffer to deal with the lower land values for what people are either maintaining it, whether it's perhaps it's an individual neighbor cutting the lawn or whatever, that's money out of that person's pocket. That's time. Gian said, let's give people a property tax break. That's a possibility for some. But then there's also the question of if you do go further and develop or rehab this property, and then you want to turn it over, you want to sell it to someone in the community, there's often a gap in that financing between what you can sell it for, what you can use this property for. And so the question of profits really comes into play. And I was wondering if on a countywide level, at least, what are we thinking about? How does the land bank or other structures work to alleviate some of those issues?
Well, thank you for the question. I don't think we have the ability, our kind of authority is clear tax, clear title, and create a process by which we can put property in the hands of people who can develop it. That is what we do. I think your point is really well taken, which is we have to treat this property like we treat property anywhere else, and maybe even property that had a higher value, which is how do you create the asset and then the structure by which it actually becomes an asset. It can be developed, people can afford to do that. And, Gian mentioned in the beginning, co-op structures. I hope I don't, make people think I have a sad life by saying like one of my dreams is to do like a scattered site, a single family co-op or 2 to 4 co-op in a community where you put, big boundaries around a 2x2 boundary or something around an area, and you control the vacant land. You buy the housing, and then people have the right to come in there in a way that doesn't require a big equity payoff in the beginning, but you can do things like pay taxes together, do maintenance together, and you de-risk asset ownership and home ownership of all sorts, because excuse me, you do some of that in a collective. And so I think, Sheila, that's one of the ways we can do that. You can put assets in the hands of individuals, but not make it quite so risky. Like, here's this thing, I hope you know how to take care of it, even if you've never owned a house. We all know that's a scary proposition from the beginning. But I think some structures like that could really be beneficial, because it collects people together. It gives them builds up equity, like the equity, like you own something equity, which leads to the other equity. And that's a mechanism to do it. It's one of the things I'd love to see.
That's awesome. What I love about this conversation is that it's also demonstrating the great thought leadership and activity that exists within our region. The folks who are on this call and the comments that folks are making and the questions that folks are asking are really sort of demonstrating that this is something that people have given quite a lot of thought to and have been engaged in for a long time. And there's multiple dimensions for us to be thinking about, whether it's Kevin's point in the chat about nonprofit capacity and the ways that we're thinking about the ways that properties get returned to the tax rolls, to Christy's point. So what this is telling me, and I think all of us here at the Trust, is that there is a ripeness and opportunity for a deeper conversation about how we can advance a conversation around reforming this system and the ways that properties find their way in. We at the Trust have, been exploring this issue going back almost 2 years now in conversations with the folks at the Land Bank and with Chris and Max and others, and really thinking about, what are the policy areas that we can engage in a deep way that really identify, that lift up and identify some of the very issues that we know are creating the wealth gaps that we see today. And when we talk about systemic racism and we talk about the systems and structures that erect barriers to wealth creation in communities of color, this is a significant example of one, and this is an opportunity for us to really help foster that kind of dialogue and surface solutions towards our strategic mission, which is closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. So I want to thank our panel and Chris and Max for doing this really important research, and Gian and Commissioner Gaynor for your leadership in our communities around these issues. And so what we hope to do, as Michael alluded to, is to sort of continue the conversation with our panelists, but also all of you around how we can be thinking about this. So as a next step, what we would ask of you, there's some great fodder in the chat, but if you have additional thoughts, reactions, ideas to what we talked about today, to share those ideas with us, with Michael and myself. Our emails are in the slide that's up right now, and we hope over the next few months, whether to have another follow-on conversation with a range of actors and folks who have really good thoughts about how we can make this system work better for our city and our region. So with that, please join me in thanking our panel, Chris, Max, Commissioner Gaynor, Gian, and Michael, of course, for your leadership on setting us up in this conversation. It's been a pleasure to tag team this with you.
Thanks. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, guys.
Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.